Hello, good morning. Today our
Hello.
guest is Meng Hu, and we're going to be talking about intelligence. Hello, Meng. How are you doing?
Very well.
Meng, so I've been reading your research for a long time, but I hesitated to send an email. Do you know why? Guess. Let me see if you can guess.
Probably has something to do with the nature of my research, I guess.
No, I hesitated because you're an Asian, and sometimes they're really shy. They
Oh,
say no. That's why I
okay,
thought
no
that you were
problem, no
going to say
problem.
no.
In this case, I'm an outlier.
Yes. But when you
And
said
that's
yes,
a
I'm
good thing
like,
for you.
great. So, Ming, you recently published a piece on the word sum test. It was published in a journal. What is word sum? What's that test? What is it measuring?
The Watson test is a vocabulary test composed of 10 items related to verbal analogies. So you're presented with, for each item, one word, and you have to find among five different options the one word that is closest to the meaning of a target word.
All right. So the word sum test is measuring cognitive ability, especially verbal ability. We're
Yes,
on
more
the,
about verbal ability.
yes,
It's a little
we're,
bit more complex, but to simplify, it's about verbal ability. It depends on whether the words used are rare, specific, or familiar words.
yes. So we are on the matter of IQ. Are IQ tests legitimate? Are they valid?
Yes, this is what the research shows at the very least. When you examine, for example, research on measurement bias, they show that the IQ tests very often are culturally valid across diverse ethnic and race groups. There might be some exceptions. For example, some studies on the South African samples show very often some biases against South African students. Not all African samples, however, show this kind of bias. I know, for example, there is one study by Russell Wan showing no bias for Ghanaians, but there is a strong measurement bias against Kenyan students compared to the white norms. But when you look in general at Western countries, Europe, or most often studies based on the United States, there is no bias.
All right. And what about culture? Are IQ tests putting blacks at a cultural disadvantage?
Um, can you be a little bit more specific?
No, are IQ tests biased against blacks? Are they culturally biased against blacks in America? That's an argument.
Well, like I said, no, because this is what the test shows. The psychometric test is non-existent for most studies. Like I said before, if you exclude the South African samples, probably, which is just and require more research and more understanding as to why it is sometimes biased, but in Western countries, there is no problem of psychometric bias so far.
All right then. And Ming, I have recognized that blacks score lower on cognitive tests everywhere. So you have a new paper with one of your co-authors studying Canada, and the conclusions show that even in Canada, black students don't perform as well as their peers.
Yes, I mean, they perform less well, but most researchers still believe that it's due to, differences in culture, especially differences in access to schooling. Well, the thing is that schooling actually doesn't really affect IQ. It doesn't really cause IQ. There are tons of evidence showing this. So it is unclear whether differences between blacks and whites is really due to differences in schooling.
All right.
So far, there is no strong evidence for this.
All right. Now back to
In the
word
case of
song.
America and Canada is quite similar, except maybe that in Canada, the black-white IQ gap is a little bit smaller. But even if it is smaller, it hasn't been proved yet that it is due to differences in culture or school or whatever.
We're going to get back to this topic, but now let's focus on word song. That's the research paper we're discussing. So what are your conclusions?
Well, the conclusion is that the Watson, despite being a very imperfect test with ceiling effect for the white groups and a reliability estimates that is not as high as one should hope, it shows no measurement bias, except for one item. So it is composed of 10 items, but there's only one item that shows strong bias against blacks at high ability. And the impact on the total score, on the latent total score, is not very big. I mean, if you, for example, want to study the black population and white population as a whole, there should be no problem, and you can use all items. If you want to specifically single out high ability blacks and high ability whites, you should be removing this one item that is strongly biased against blacks. So the
And
conclusion is that there is only one item that is biased.
and what is this item?
Mm, I think this has something to do with the word, if I remember, cloistered, the word G.
Okay.
This is the label of the item, but it has something to do with cloistered, finding the synonymous of cloistered. I think this is a word that is not used so often today, but it's the only one that is probably biased, that
Okay.
is biased.
And Meng, in 20, I pay attention to studies. So usually when I read a study, I will remember the conclusion and the author's name, especially when you're disseminating this type of research to the public as an interviewer, you have to know what you're talking about as an interviewer, me. So some years ago in 2017, you did a study, again, it was on word song, and you noted that the gap was not declining, the
Yes,
racial gap. So could you shed some light on that older study?
yes. So it was a response initially to Hauser and Wang. I think he published their study in 2001, something like this. And they showed that the black and white gap in the Watson test declined seriously. I mean, drastically. The problem is that they used normal regression. They didn't use what is called the multi-level regression because age and cohort effects are so highly correlated that you cannot use a normal classical regression. You have to use a multi-level regression and specifying age and cohort as different effects. For example, you have to specify age variable as a fixed effect and cohort as a random effects. If you use the right specification and model, the conclusion is very different. I used a normal regression and a regression specified like the Tobit regression for data that are censored for the upper levels because, as I said earlier, the Watson test is not measuring very well the true ability of white people because there is a non-trivial portion of white people who scored 10 out of 10. So there is a ceiling effect for these people. So using these normal and Tobit regressions, I found that indeed Hauser and Wang were right, and the gap declined seriously across cohorts. But that's not the case anymore when you use multi-level regression, which is the right way to separate age and cohorts.
Great. Ming, have you ever done a word sum test?
Myself, no. No.
Okay,
I
okay.
know the items and the answer options, but I never took the test.
All right. And there's,
I don't think this is the best test to take or examine because, like I said, it is a very short test. And the proof is because of how the test is short. That's probably the reason why a non-trivial portion of white people scored 10 out of 10. But if you made the test longer, for example, like 15 items, probably some white people would get 14, 13, or 12 in raw score. And when I look at the distribution of the black scores, almost none of them, I mean, very few scored 10 out of 10. So even if you increase the test length, not many blacks will score 11, 12, or 13.
do you remember the average black score?
I think it was in raw score for the Watson test. It was 5 points and it was 6 points for whites. So there is a 1 point gap, 1.1 exactly.
Okay, okay. All
It
right.
differs a little bit across cohorts, but it's 1.1.
We also do know, Meng, that Blacks do better on the language component of IQ tests. This is how we know that IQ tests are not biased because Blacks do better on the culturally loaded components of the test.
Yes, this is what was found many decades ago, especially by Arthur Jensen. He argued that, well, if IQ objects because they contain high, huge components of knowledge and culture, then why in the culture loaded tests such as verbal abilities, the white and black scores are the lowest. I mean, the smaller, show a smaller gap. So what he said, Jensen, was correct.
Yes. And Michael J. Levin, he wrote an excellent book some years ago, Why Race Matters. In one of his topics, Michael Levin argues that blacks, their performance on IQ tests would indicate the likelihood that they're going to do better on other academic tests, but they actually do better on the IQ test relative to other academic tests. It was an old study, he was citing a really old study to debunk the idea that IQ tests are biased against blacks.
I mean, if a point is about predictive validity, I don't know if this is the case, but um, if IQ tests generally are biased against blacks, they will show a different predictive validity, different correlation between IQ and socioeconomic outcomes, such as educational attainment, occupational status, income, etc., or maybe even health measures later in life. But in reality, the black and white predictive validity is similar. In other words, the correlation between IQ and achievement is similar between the groups. This is true
Yes,
for example, Asians, whites, Hispanics, and blacks. Mostly they use the SAT score
yes. And
for addiction tests.
SAT scores correlate with IQ ability. And I'm just going to cite the Determined study that was done by Determined and his co-authors some years ago, because people may want the evidence. But I've always been on the right. I don't consider IQ to be a political issue. That's a scientific and psychological issue. But some persons have opted to politicize IQ. So I was once an environmentalist, but the evidence isn't favorable to that thesis based on what I've been reading. And I know
Oh,
enough about economics and culture to posit that racial differences are not recent. So I have a degree in history. I studied history and international relations in school, and racial differences in cognitive ability and personality, they were observed even before the colonial period, long before the colonial period. So,
yes.
for example, slave traders, when European slave traders went to Africa, they often commented that the smarter Africans with strong mathematical skills, they suffered from financial problems. And as a result, Africans often defaulted. Therefore, they had to resort to pawning to compensate for the loss. So even in that era, we we noticed that blacks were lower in long-term orientation. So black slave traders were making money. The slave trade was profitable. Their profits were not super exceptional, but they were making money, yet they consistently defaulted on loans. Why were they defaulting on loans? For a number of reasons. Conspicuous consumption, that was one reason. So we know that racial differences are not recent. And the variations in the environment between blacks and whites is not that great. Most black Americans are not poor. And middle class blacks don't outperform middle class whites. Richer blacks actually do worse than working class whites and Asians. So I no longer subscribe to the notion that the gap is environmental.
I mean, there is another piece of evidence that no one talks about. Maybe because they don't have a great sample size, or because not many people talk about them. But this group is about uh, Amerindian, American Indian, and these people they score definitely on cognitive tests better than blacks. But when you look at the socioeconomic status, for example, family income, occupational status, or whatever, they score much lower than blacks. They are much poorer than blacks, and their scholastic achievements tend to be not better than blacks. But their cognitive scores are better.
Yes, academically, Native Americans are not an impressive group. So I've read the Administra studies, and being of Native American ancestry does not significantly predict positive academic outcomes. So I agree with you on that point that scholastically they're not as exceptional as other groups. But Meng, you have been doing several admixture studies. What is an admixture study and what are your studies showing?
Well, admixture regressions typically use, at least the ones I conducted with John First, for example, they use multiple, I mean, not multiple, multi-level regression. This time, however, with a focus on fixed component effects. Um, it controls for genetic ancestry, as you probably know. So let's say you have a bunch of ethnic variables such as Hispanics, Blacks, East Asians, and American Indian, and Hispanics, if I haven't said so already. And then you add a bunch of variables related to ancestry. For example, you have a proportion of Black ancestry as opposed to white ancestry. And then you have East Asian ancestry, you have Amerindian ancestry, and then you can also add other covariates such as states, regions, age, sex, etc. And it shows that the economic gaps in terms of income and socioeconomic status seem to vanish when you look at Hispanic white gap and black white gap. In fact, for the black white gap, it's quite surprising because when you look at the income and just income, not education, but income, when you control for genetic ancestry, blacks earn more money than whites.
Explain.
I'm not really sure why. I don't have a good explanation as to why. Mm, I know one thing, however, that another studies that show similar finding is that, for example, when you study some samples in the US, again, you control for general factor of intelligence, and then you look at the interaction between blacks and whites differences with income, and you see that it increases. That is, um, blacks have more income than whites after controlling for IQ, and even before controlling for education. So even if you don't control for education, but merely for general factor of intelligence, the blacks show higher income than whites. Again, I'm not even sure why,
Well, maybe you
but this
should
is what they show. In fact,
reanalyze
it has
the
been
study.
shown to be the case for a long time. I think the first time I've heard of it was from the bell curve from Einstein and Murray. They showed this. When you control for cognitive ability, the blacks show sometimes better outcomes than whites, especially on income.
Yes. I didn't read this paper, so I don't want to cite it, but I read an academic paper citing Flynn 1991, arguing that blacks do better than what their IQ would predict. But I didn't analyze the paper on my own accord. So I'm not going to comment on its efficacy because sometimes you're reading an academic article and a scholar cites a paper. But when you read the paper on your own, you realize that his conclusion is incompatible with the conclusion of the author. But the scholar cited in 1991, and that was the implication of the research that blacks do better than what their IQ would predict.
Yes, this is typically what is found. The overprediction of blacks in terms of social outcomes when you control for cognitive abilities. Some studies I know, however, found that the overprediction disappears if you control for additional covariates. In other words, they say that if blacks tend to perform better than what was predicted, it's because they did not include enough covariates. When they include enough covariates, there's no difference between whites and blacks in terms of prediction.
All right then. Meng, you also did something really fabulous recently, and I enjoyed that paper. You penned a paper on the mother effect. You were responding to a study done in the 1970s. Some consider this study to be a profound refutation of the environmental thesis, but you reanalyzed the data and concluded otherwise.
Which
The
study
Willerman
specifically?
study, the 1974 study, that paper was in
1990.
2022, Erasing Mother Effect, where you were examining the relationship between maternal effects and IQ because a study in,
The Wheelerman study, 1974,
four, yes,
74, yeah, yeah.
yes.
So
So
I did this because uh, a lot of people, especially recently,
no, stop.
saw this.
Meng, I don't want to cut you, but I have to let me tell you why I'm cutting you because the Willerman study is seen as the classic refutation of the black-white IQ gap because most of these studies, the admixture studies are really old and have been debunked, but the Willerman study was not seriously refuted. So that's why I appreciate your research.
Yeah, no
So
problem, thanks.
yeah, you can go ahead and talk. You can go ahead and tell us
Uh,
about it.
well, I mean, yes, the study, or yes, of course, I heard about the studies of Willerman so often, especially even now. Um, the problem I have is that typically the environmentalist group of researchers typically say if that some of the hereditarians, for example, cite some old studies, especially from Arthur Jensen, and they said, oh, this is an old study, you should be not citing it. But then they go on to cite old studies such as Willerman.
And Whitty and
So
Jenkins.
yes, yes, also.
Old
So
studies, they're
there's one
also
thing
old.
that, yes, this is why I wanted to analyze this field, the Willerman study, despite being old, because I was told that they used IQ at age 4. And we know from research that the IQ the IQ gap will probably increase with age because genetic expression increases with age. The genetic factors increases with age. So if you examine black-white gap at age 4, it tells nothing about the adult gap. But I know there is a data they didn't analyze for the age 7. They only showed you infant IQ gap and age 4 IQ gap, but not the age 7 IQ gap. So I wanted to see what will happen if you examine the age 7 IQ gap. And apparently, the IQ gap halved at age 7. And if it diminished by such a big amount, maybe it suggests, again, just a suggestion, it's not a proof. It's a suggestion that maybe an adult, the advantage of having white mothers as opposed to black mothers will vanish over time.
Exactly, because the Willerman study was controversial. It was arguing, for those who are unfamiliar with the study, it was arguing that when blacks and whites were compared, the environmental differences were not great. The socioeconomic position of the mothers were similar, yet the only gap that was observed, that was observed was the higher intelligence of the children of white women. And he attributed that to maternal effect, saying that these maternal environments were superior. Therefore, the black-white IQ gap is environmental because when we studied the socioeconomic status of these groups, we didn't find much disparities. That was the conclusion of the Willerman study. So it
Yes, I
made
mean,
it, yes, at the time it was seen as a high quality study.
at first glance, I would understand why people are sold to this theory because despite um, classical twin studies showing that adoption studies and twin studies, they show that environmental effects, especially home effects, vanish over time. So at adult, it becomes zero. The house environment becomes zero. But this is a study within the white population. And people would say, well, black environments are different. So yes, it is true that environmental factors vanish over time for the for the white population only, not for the black. So that's why probably a lot of people definitely were sold on the studies and hypotheses made by Willerman because he used the white mother's environment and see whether it impacts the black IQ. So if it does, if it really does, then it's a strong indication that white environment and black environments are different, and maybe they have different heritability estimates. So in other words, black IQs will be more malleable than the white IQs. But if Wilderman hypothesis is falsified, then maybe there is more convincing evidence now that black and white environments are not so different than what
No,
some earlier people expected.
Meng, why would a black and white environment be different? What would explain the variance? If black people do trail behind whites in terms of reading, some would say that this is cultural slash environmental, but it could also be genetic because if one has a genetic proclivity for intellectual activity, he's going to read more. So the fact that black people don't read as much as white people is not evidence in favor of environmental explanations. Intelligent people will create more stimulating environments.
Yes, this is known as the gene-environment correlation. People with higher IQ would seek better environments that are more cognitively stimulating. And reversely, for people with low IQ, they will seek environments that are bad for their cognitive stimulation. The thing is that, as I mentioned before, there are many studies, especially quasi-experimental studies, on schooling effect on IQ, and they don't show a good impact on IQ, or just, for example, an impact in some specific areas. For example, most studies of quasi-experimental schooling effect show that verbal ability or crystallized abilities are boosted by schooling, especially schooling reforms, but not fluid abilities. And this is enough to disprove the idea that the general factor of intelligence can be boosted by education. Another problem also is that a lot of these studies, for example, um, examining schooling effect, only use male samples. And those who use male and female samples, sometimes they find that, for example, schooling impacts greatly the IQ of male students, but not female students at all. They show no improvement at all for the schooling reforms. And that begs the question, is it true that schooling affects, IQ? If that's the case, then why, for example, fluid abilities don't improve, why female don't improve, etc. So if we have good evidence that schooling doesn't affect IQ, then maybe IQ affects um, education and not the other way around.
No, but what you're saying is true. So Determine again, he has a study on this particular topic, and there's the Plowman study. Academic performance is quite genetic. It correlates with genes and the genetic relationship between intelligence and performance. That's what the Plowman study that was done a few years ago showed. Genes make schools. So
Yes,
schooling can improve IQ by 6 points, around 6 points. That's what Stuart Ritchie said. But again, that's a minor effect, and the IQ increment could peter out. So I use the terms IQ increment or IQ surplus. When low IQ children are adopted by upper class couples, they will record a boost in IQ. So the IQ could be, let's say, 60. Then when they're 10, their IQ is like 115. By the time these people are like 70, the IQ is 101. So they lose most of the surplus.
yes. At the end, this is what most studies show. There is no difference anymore between the experimental and control groups in the follow-up studies, follow-up years. And in this case, the adoption studies is consistent with the conclusion that education has no real impact on the general intelligence.
Yeah. Ming, I read your blog. You have a blog and I've read your blog.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the writing is superb. I like the writing. And years ago, you wrote an article saying that the the Sandra Scar study, the Minnesota study, that it did not necessarily validate the hereditarian assumption. Do you remember that article? You wrote it like 10 years ago.
Yes, you mean the transracial adoption
Yeah,
study?
yes,
Yes,
yes.
yes, because there are lots and lots of covariates, especially variables about the biological parents that we don't know. So it's not perfectly controlled. So the conclusion is at best very ambiguous. I don't think it's validating so much the hereditarian hypothesis, but definitely it doesn't validate the environmental hypothesis either. I would say if transracial adoption, okay, takes just one side, I would say it probably supports a little bit more hereditarian hypothesis, but just a little bit more.
Yes. There's this article by Charles Locorto, published in 1990. It's still a classic piece. It was an examination of the malleability of IQ. Our
In
adoption,
adoption studies,
yes, yes,
yes,
our
I
adoption
remember
studies,
that. I remember that. That's an
yes, good.
excellent article.
Yeah, it's excellent. But Charles Locorto is one of the best researchers on IQ. He's not as famous as other people, but he's really good. And I remember his point vividly. Adoption studies don't tell us much about the malleability of IQ.
Well, I mean, the article, if I remember correctly, is mainly a summary of defects in adoption studies and
Yes,
why they fail to produce convincing results for either hypothesis. And this uh, collection of arguments he had is very, very strong.
yes, I agree. And he cited a plethora of data. So, for example, we don't have enough information on the IQ of biological parents to make conclusive opinions. But I'm going to close this link, and if you have time, I'll send you a second one.
Okay.
Great.